Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. People are still trickling in, but since it is just after noon Eastern Standard Time, we will start. And as other people join in, well, they can just join us at that point. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci beaucoup de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui à cet événement sur le Yémen, sur la guerre au Yémen. L'événement va être en anglais, mais je voulais quand même pouvoir souhaiter la bienvenue à tout le monde. My name is Thomas Junot. I am a professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. كلمة افتتاح باللغة العربية فقط قليلا. مرحبا في المؤتمر الرابع عن الحرب في اليمن في جامعة أوتاوا. المؤتمر سيكون باللغة الإنجليزية، للأسف ما عندنا الترجمة. في مؤتمرات ماضية بحثنا مثلا عن الوضع في الجنوب ودور بلدان المنطقة. اليوم سنركز المناقشة على دور الفاعلين المحليين كمثلا المجتمع المدني والقبائل والأحزاب السياسية. I am very proud of hosting our fourth annual Yemen conference here at the University of Ottawa. We have done this for a few years now. We find that it's important to continue bringing attention to the war in Yemen here in Canada, but as long as we're in pandemic times and we are doing this virtually, people from elsewhere can join us. Previous events have looked at the situation in the south, at regional politics. Today, we take a bit of a different view. Much of the focus, as many of you will know, on the war in Yemen has largely focused on the role of regional actors, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the US, the UN. These are all obviously very important actors, but the role of local Yemeni actors tends to get neglected, especially in Western focus in the media, in discussions on the war. So that is what we are going to focus on today. And I could not think of two better speakers to help us to do that. First, Nadwa Al-Dawsari is a researcher and conflict practitioner with 20 years of field experience in Yemen. She is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. And if you want to look for her published work, you can find it on her blog, yementribalvoices.org. Farea Al-Muslimi is the chairman and co-founder of the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies, where I am also a non-resident fellow myself. So technically, I think that makes Farea my boss in a way. He is also an associate fellow at with Chatham House. So we are going to follow a fairly informal format today. We decided to move away from longer, more rigid presentations. I think we've had a lot of that over the last 2 years over Zoom or Teams or other formats. So we'll be a bit more informal, a bit more flexible. I will ask Farea and Nadwa questions. They'll answer. There'll be a bit of a dialogue format between the two of them. And later during the hour, I will open it up for Q&A with everybody who is here today. For that, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a Q&A function, not the chat function, please, but the Q&A one. And you can type up your questions there, and I will read them out for you. So to begin, if I can ask Nadwa first to start, if you can give us just a quick overview of the political situation in Yemen, just to put the situation in context for those in attendance who may be a bit less familiar with the war.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Thomas, for pronouncing my name perfectly. I'm impressed. So the political situation and the conflict situation in Yemen is at an impasse. We've been at a political impasse basically since the war started. We've been at a military stalemate since early 2020. We have the Houthis on one side, and then we have the anti-Houthi forces on the other side. Within the anti-Houthi forces, we have the Hadi government, we have the Tarab Saleh forces and the National Resistance Forces, and also we have the SDC in the south. And the main characteristic of the anti-Houthi forces is that they are in disagreement. They are fighting each other basically, and there is political disagreement between the Hadi government and Tarab Saleh, and between SDC and Hadi government, but also There has been clashes between SEC allied forces and Hadi government, which unfortunately led to a dire security and humanitarian situation in Aden. I just came back from Aden and I am incredibly disturbed by the food prices. It's the food, since I was there in mid-2019, the food prices have increased by probably 1,000%. I have no idea how people survive. So the political scene is not promising within the anti-Houthi forces. The Houthis are too fixated on a military win and are not willing to compromise. So we're at an impasse. We're at a stalemate militarily, and at the same time, the humanitarian conditions on the ground are deteriorating rapidly.
Thank you. That's a great way to just frame the issue to begin. If I can move on to Farea, if you can describe a bit the peace efforts. Nadwa very quickly alluded to it, but if you can expand a bit on what we've seen so far, what has happened, and basically why it hasn't worked out very well so far.
Thank you, Thomas and Nadwa. It hasn't worked because there has been no political process to start with, because there has been no political investment in the idea of the possibility of peace in Yemen. Yes, there are various efforts by various envoys from the United Nations, but when you look into the international and regional investment in Yemen, it's a war investment. Whether you speak of the United States, whether you speak of Canada, the United Kingdom, Europe, or actually the regional countries. Despite the various attempts by international frameworks to try to put Yemen's, to try to have a conversation about Yemen, that has not in fact been reflected in an investment on peace efforts, as you would imagine, especially keeping in mind the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. That's one thing. The second reason when it comes to political process is obviously when you go into a civil war, you lose a lot of things as a domestic or as a domestic political actors or as a society. Among them is your ability to solve your own issues. That's why we had the GCC in 2011 intervening. That's why we had the United Nations before and after that. And obviously that's what has happened in Yemen the last 5 to actually 10 years in that regard. That's one reason is because we are in a war as Yemenis, our ability to have a conflict resolution based on a Yemeni tools as in the past is actually absent. Because even the dependence on international has not just been a dependence of resources, of food, but even on peace process the last 10 years. And probably that's what has been one of the biggest issues facing the country at the moment. There is one last final thing maybe I want to mention, which I think is important in understanding the current aspects of war in Yemen, is because yes, this war is a layer civil war. In many layers, it's a failed state and all of these things that comes with that package, but also in many layers, it's a proxy war. And when a proxy war happens, as you know, whether you're speaking of Iran or UAE or Saudi Arabia, it is, in my opinion, more destructive than direct wars. Because proxy wars, by the end of the day, they destroy your ability to fight and your ability to conflict resolution. That's also, that happens from outside supporters to their allies, more than actually to their enemies. The ability of Yemenis or the ability of the Yemeni sides to fight, but also to come into a peace regarding that fight has been much weaker because of the proxy war nature of the war also in the country, which is not exclusive to Yemen. That partially applies to Syria. You can see that partially in Libya, and you can see it also in different countries around the world. That is another issue I think we're looking at. Finally, is there is even in the, I know we're speaking about the local actors and their role, but the international aspect of peacemaking and peace mediation needs to change fundamentally. In the way it has been happening the last 10 years, it is an attempt to solve these conflicts directly. I am not sure that's actually any more feasible. I am not sure that's actually the right investment, whether we're speaking of the UN or all of the track 2 existing around the world. Instead, there has to be a different mechanism, a different approach, a one that has less deliverables, less short-term goals, and less of a quick wins, as you would call them. Quick wins are a serious problem, whether they are in war or whether they are in peacemaking. And I believe that's one of the reasons we are facing a deadlock or an absence also of the peace process in Yemen. Over.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So as I said in the introduction, when the Western media, for example, talks about the war in Yemen, there's a lot of focus on the role of the UN, the various regional powers, the US. These are all very important, but in those discussions on the Western side, there's a neglect of the role, of the interests, of the capabilities, the intentions of a range of actors on the ground in Yemen. It's not to say that the international dimension does not matter. Of course it does, but it's being discussed a lot, whereas the more domestic side is being neglected in many discussions. So this is what I wanted to focus on much more today. So the first 10 minutes, I think, were a very useful introduction to put this discussion into broader context, but now I'd like us to zoom in a bit more on that local dimension. So starting with Nadwa, if you can tell us a bit about some of the key actors that you focused on who should have, or don't, but maybe there are reasons for that, have a role in the in an eventual, keeping in mind what Farea just said in terms of the absence of an actual political process, but in those discussions that we're seeing or not seeing right now.
Yeah, I agree with what Farea said about the quick wins. I think the current peace process, it's very difficult for the current peace process to achieve progress, mainly because internationals don't have leverage over conflict parties. The Saudis have leverage. The Saudis are probably the only actor that has leverage on pretty much all the local actors who have, except the Houthis, of course. The Minorities have leverage on some of the actors. So on the ground, you have the Houthis, and then you have Tariq Saleh forces, and you have STC, and these are the visible forces that have gained traction in the media. But there are other forces as well that are not really, that are influential on the ground, but they don't make the headlines. I have been, since 2018, I've been working mainly with armed actors, state, but also hybrid actors. Most of these actors were formed by the coalition, and they're assumed to be STC forces, but they're STC allied forces by design. You have areas where local authorities have established some sort of, autonomy, but also success stories. You have Marib, you have Shabwa, to some extent also Hadramaut. And these areas, they're not part of any other political actors that I have mentioned. So these actors they have a stake, they will want to have a say in a future, Yemen. But what I want to say in all of this is that we're not ready for a peace process where all these actors come together and agree on some sort of, an arrangement where they end the war, and then they agree on, a governance model that, where everybody's represented. We're not there yet. We're at the national level, we have the Houthis who are unwilling to compromise, unwilling to de-escalate, unwilling to accept a ceasefire, unwilling to give anything. They want everything, and they don't want to compromise. And so that's a major challenge. And then on the other side, you have the Hadi government that has a seat on the table, but it doesn't really have much influence on the ground. It's being kicked out of the capital of Aden. Now it has symbolic presence in the capital city of Aden. And you have the Tariq Saleh forces and the STC. They don't have a place around the table. But even if all these actors have a place around the table, whatever agreement they come up with, it will be very hard to implement on the ground. So I think Yemen is not ready for peace yet. I think the conflict will have to run its course and evolve, where at some point Yemenis decide that we need to coexist and we need to agree on some sort of way forward that does not include violence. Now, my theory is for a way forward in the direction of peace, the Houthis have to be weakened militarily, because they are the only actor who is unwilling to de-escalate. and they're the only actor who seizes every opportunity, including peace agreements. And we saw that happening in the Stockholm Agreement, to regroup and reposition their forces and take more land. And that doesn't help peace. Having said that, I don't think there is any serious intention from the coalition and the Hadi government and all these actors to work together to achieve that. So we're left with a situation where the war will continue. And I don't know how long that's going to take, but I know that we're not ready for peace yet. The ingredients for peace are not there yet. The ingredients for a political solution are not there yet.
Thank you. Farea, up to you. Same question. Can you tell us a bit more about the role of some of the key local actors that you've been watching?
Local actors have always been efficient in solving conflicts in Yemen and in making a long-term conflict resolution mechanisms. And that's also for a lot of reasons they have been effective in the past, because the nature of holding someone accountable within these domestic aspects has been possible. There is a different world of or worldview of accountability in Yemen if you break or make a ceasefire, if you make a war or start a war. That has always been the case. In these actors, you have had sometimes various actors. You have had the most obvious one, obviously, is the tribes, which is a social entity that exists based on two basic rules, which is inclusion and exclusion. If you do this or you commit to that, you are included in the whole system of the tribal system. If you violate this code or if you violate this peace agreement, you are excluded from this larger formula of social. And therefore, there was always an accountability system in some way. That was, for example, one. You also have had different political actors, whether you speak of groups or you speak of political leaders. The main difference this time is there are a lot of money and a lot of guns getting into the country. So these domestic aspects, whether for the tribes you're speaking, or you're speaking of political parties which we have engaged, or even by female mediators across Yemen. And I'm not talking just about the larger aspect of the war, which is the national war or the civil war, or also the one where there is a regional intervention. But even in the most basic and domestic national local level, even if it's a dispute about water, even if it's a dispute about solving or opening a road, these mechanisms has been there, and some of them actually continues to engage. Again, despite the fact that there is a lot of guns and a lot of money coming from outside actors. But the nature right now in which we have had the last few years, there was always a rules of engagement in Yemen. This rules of engagement, whether it was you're a tribal man or you're a tribal entity, this was possible because there was these rules. These rules are much weakened by now. And also because the nature of the conflict is so huge in Yemen. In the past, you have had, maybe you would have a conflict in Marib, maybe you would have a conflict in Aden. Everyone else would jump into solving that conflict. By now, everything is everywhere is more or less in its own definition, a proxy war or a war by itself. So that also leaves people with a very little ability even to solve or to work as firefighters, whether you're speaking of social groups or of political groups or even of state institutions in that regards. And when you look, this is important because when you look right now into the intensity in the country, in many times the last 2 years, it was not anymore the front lines between the Houthis and the pro-Hadi government forces. Sometimes you saw it in Mahra, thousands of kilometers away from the front lines. Sometimes you saw it in Socotra. Sometimes you saw it in Aden, within these forces themselves. The nature of this, almost the whole place is in fire, obviously exhausts all the domestic mechanisms that we are going through in the country. There is also one thing different or additional this time is that the resources to solve a conflict is much limited compared to the resources if you want to start a conflict in Yemen. There is another issue, obviously, has to do with the war economy, in which is if you are a beneficiary of this war, you have much less incentives to solve this war. Yemenis are ready to end this war. They have exhausted from it. And obviously, this is not like anything they have seen. But you have, and this is another issue, is you have a serious problem of political elite, of political leadership, of a war economy, and of a fraud international mechanisms of intervention that has been going through the country. The difference also this time is maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, if the outside backed off, whether that outside is the UN or UAE or Iran or IMF or anyone. Yemenis could have found a way probably to solve everything by themselves. I don't think, unfortunately, that's anymore the case at the moment. What you can do is probably play firefighting in small levels, on the domestic levels, but in the larger national level of how this fragmentation has happened in Yemen is different, because we don't have just state fragmentation or a structure fragmentation, but we are having a narrative of fragmentation, a fragmentation of the idea of how we understood war and peace between each other. These rules, this code of conduct has been fragmented over the last few years. And hence, we have to first start to be able to rebuild some sort of narrative, to rebuild some sort of this unspoken and unwritten tools of accountability mechanisms. And then probably all of these efforts can add something into some sort of success. An example of that, for example, which Nadwa has written extensively about and knows very well, is the exchange of prisoners. In the past, also, there has been a hijacking of a lot of things in Yemen, but also there has been even hijacking of peace processes. When you look in the past into exchange of prisoners, it was efficient when it was done by domestic aspects. It was efficient in a tribal way, in a social way, in different way. By now, that when last year there was an exchange of prisoners, when that file was taken, for example, into the hands of the international frameworks, in fact, it erupted it. And in fact, it became hostage to a deadlock international mechanism. By the end of the day, neither managed to succeed in solving this by itself, nor let the Yemeni domestic aspect of doing business as usual in that regard. Over.
Thank you. Just as a quick reminder, I have one last question that I will ask the two speakers before we move on to the Q&A with everybody in attendance, but please don't hesitate to start writing questions in the Q&A box that you can see at the bottom of your Zoom window. So one last question for the two of you, and maybe this time we can start with Farea. The two of you touched on this a bit, but I would like you to expand a bit more on solutions. So the two of you painted a portrait of the situation that is quite bleak, quite tragic on the humanitarian front, how at the political level it's blocked in many ways. Understanding, as the two of you said, and I 100% agree with this, that there's no easy fix, there's no quick fix. Looking down the road, what has to happen for there to be process? What are key movements, key decisions that could be made at the local level? But if you want to broaden the discussion, please don't hesitate. That would help things, that would be necessary as building blocks for a longer term peace process to actually be viable. Maybe starting with Farea this time.
Domestically, I think one of the main issues also we have is big part of this war side is outside the country. And this is, they are no more accountable or can be held accountable to Yemenis. This is a serious issue. You have a country being run by a president who has no shame to say he's still the president 7 years later and he's outside the country. So the absence of these brokers from the country makes them not even in the need to make any compromise or to think or to do their homework. This is very important, I think, in moving forward, is you have to have the feet of all the actors back on the ground in Yemen. That will change their math. That will change the way they think of many ways. There has to be, that's one thing. There has to be, in addition to that, an ability to separate the humanitarian or the code, the tribal aspects we have had from the political one. We always fought in Yemen, but we didn't really cut throats. We fought, but we didn't kidnap people in the same way if that happens. Going back to the essence of what Yemen has been, which is a legacy of conflict that's not a little, I think would do us good as Yemenis, even if the larger war continues to happen in many ways. That's obviously on the domestic level. There has to be more function or more focus in tracking the war economy. This is important. You have a lot of beneficiaries of this war. Despite what they say in TV, despite what they do, they have interests with each other. And trying to hunt down these economic interests and expose them to the Yemenis, I think will be important. And finally, and this is less on Yemen, but also on the regional aspect, is the Gulf has to take a decision to be part of the solution in Yemen rather than part of the problem. In 2011, because it was not a side to this war, it was able to hold an honorable or an honorary umbrella of the GCC deal. By now, it's no more in that position of being a neutral and of being able to actually be part of the solution in Yemen. And that will take some rethinking, specifically from Saudi Arabia. I think it needs to learn more from, not the Omani playbook, because by now the Omani playbook has been actually bad, but rather the Kuwaiti playbook in that regard of the region. I think that's important to think in that regard. Similarly, obviously, we have a similar issue with the Iranians. And when it comes that there is a feeling that they can do whatever they want in Yemen because everyone needs them in Vienna. Everyone needs to talk to them in Vienna. This obviously changes their math in becoming extremely destructive in Yemen in various regards. And finally, if I'm asked for one idea suggestion internationally, also the peace process should start from the new diplomatic framework, and that solution is not in Sana'a or in Riyadh or in Tehran. That diplomatic framework is in New York. We have to go back into the framework of 2216, the framework of the diplomatic architect that the UN envoy is currently given. It is a self-defeating framework. 2216 and all of the package that comes with it are war resolution. They are not peacemaking resolutions. And that important aspect has to happen. Yes, it's not in Yemen, but it is still important because it dominates what ultimately we are doing in Yemen and what we are negotiating by the end of the day. Over.
Thank you. Nadwa, over to you.
Yes, I agree with Farea. So I think what we need to do, we need first to have a surgery to save the patient's life first, and then we need to nurture that patient to back to life. Okay, and so I think two things need to happen. First of all, I think I have to stress again that there is a disconnect between the peace process and the situation on the ground and the potential on the ground. And so what needs to happen first is to change the dynamics on the ground where incentives for peace are more favorable. And then, and that includes a lot of what Farah said, but I will add to that. And then we need to prepare the grounds to build blocks for peace to happen in the future. And I think, I have to say again that reaching peace will be a long-term process, and it will require patience, and it will require commitment. First, I think what needs to happen as a surgery, the Saudis need to unite the anti-Houthi forces politically and militarily. And again, the Saudis are the only people who can do that because they're the only actor that has influence on all the anti-Houthi forces. And so politically, so that they can work together in the negotiations, but also militarily, so that they can push the Houthis militarily far enough where the Houthis feel that their best alternative is to come to the negotiations table in good faith. Right now, they think they're winning, and they think that they don't need to compromise. So that is necessary. But on the other side, there has to be some work on the ground in a bottom-up approach to build blocks for peace to happen in the future. And I've been working with the tribes since 2018. I've been working with informal actors and local civil society actors. And I can say that there's a lot that happens on the ground that's promising. So for example, the tribes has been a blessing in Yemen. The tribes have maintained peace. They've maintained security on the roads. They've actually developed codes during the war where their members who take different sides in the fighting, they go fight in the front lines and they come back and they don't bring the fight back home. So they've managed to shield their areas from the consequences of political divisions and conflict. And that is why Yemen is largely relatively stable given all the humanitarian and the security conditions the country is suffering from. Over the past few years, also, there's been an emerging civil society movement across areas like Taiz, like Aden, like the South, where civil society actors, and that it's not necessarily NGOs or civil society organizations, but that include groups, youth groups, women groups, informal groups, lawyers, human rights activists who have successfully held armed actors accountable for violations against human rights, and who have pressured these actors to be more transparent and more respectful for civilians. So I think what should be done is to lay the grounds for peace, to work at the local level, to look at areas that are promising, and kind of support these areas so that they're more stable. So in this case, support civil society organizations that work, or groups that work on accountability mechanisms for armed actors. I wouldn't recommend engaging with the tribes. This is an informal structure, it's a Yemeni structure. I don't want outsiders to interfere with the tribes. I think that will backfire. But if you want to help Yemen, if you want to help stabilize these areas, you need to work on local governance, and you need to work on improving services, and you need to work on improving security, work with security actors. There is a lot that can be done that can promote these pockets of stability throughout Yemen, so that will do one thing, that will prevent the cycle of deterioration and the cycle of fragmentation. And that will build more resilience, and mitigate the impact of the conflict on ordinary Yemenis. And in time, when people are ready for peace, when the conditions are ripe, then these local structures can engage in a peace process, and that will make the peace process even more sustainable, because it will have all these actors that we have helped strengthen, that will then be part of a future peace process, and whatever political arrangement that will happen in the future.
Thank you. Thanks for all your answers for the two of you. So I will now move on to the Q&A session with everybody in attendance. Please, as I said, don't hesitate to write questions in the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your Zoom window. I have a first one here. I have only one so far. I'll ask that one. I have some questions in reserve if nobody else steps up, but please feel free to add questions. So first question from Corinne, asking if you can talk about the role of religious minorities in building peace in Yemen. How do you see the inclusion of the human right to freedom of religion or belief contributing to a durable peace in Yemen? Maybe starting with Nadwa this time.
I mean, obviously, freedom of religion is important, and it will contribute to peace. But I think the Yemen conflict doesn't have much to do with religious oppression. It's not really a religious conflict. It's not a sectarian conflict. Like Farea said, it has so many layers, and most of them have to do with power, with resources, and with regional actors having different agendas that that impacted Yemen in a very negative way.
Yes, I mean, religion plays a very important role in a society like Yemen, whether the larger sects or the small minorities. And in fact, it is in a way how it also has dealt with terrible times and wars, is to go back to religion, which is also obviously not a surprise. In matter of religious minorities, and I believe whether it's religious or ethical, ethnic or demographic minorities in Yemen, one of the reasons why we continue to have cycles and cycles of violence is because every majority always thinks they can eat the minority. And I'm talking about the majority here, not necessarily only in numbers, but you can be like the Houthis today. You are a minority, for example, but you have a majority of control of weapons, of resource. You have a majority of a lot of things. And obviously this has always been the case. Similarly, like in Syria, Bashar al-Assad have used minorities, as an excuse to stay in power brutally. Similarly, in Yemen, the Houthis have practiced a brutal aggression against the minorities. And I believe, again, this is why we have more and more cycles of violence in Yemen. I must say that one of the saddest day of my life, actually more than when the Houthis took over Sana'a or when the war started, was when I saw the last group of Yemeni Jewish leaving to Israel a few years ago. I think that was frightening for me as a Yemeni, because especially religiously, but really all sorts of minorities. Nations die when their minorities die. Imagine Lebanon without Christians. Imagine Palestine without Muslims, or some sects of the Islamic. So the absence of the majority to always the inability to protect minorities, but also to use them, and for the nation to not understand the larger value of religion, of minorities, is always a big issue. Thank you.
Thank you. So a good question from Emily here, who says, given the ongoing high-level humanitarian needs and the political economy and interests in conflict, do you have any thoughts on how can formal humanitarian actors engage more effectively beyond engaging local civil society groups? What recommendations would you have to support principled engagement, especially in the North, where engagement opportunities can be less straightforward? Maybe starting this time with Farea.
I'm still reading the question. Can you repeat it or jump to Nadwa?
Okay, Nadwa, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, sure. I'm not a humanitarian expert, but I would like to see a shift of focus, not entirely, but where we focus more on economic development, on local economy, than focusing on delivering food. The problem with humanitarian assistance is that in Yemen, it has had several problems, including being diverted to fighters and fighters' families, and being used as an incentive or a way to coerce families to send fighters, and particularly in the Houthi-controlled areas. The problem also in the south, and I've heard this when I was in Aden and Abiyan this time, is that so most of the IDPs come from the north. They come to these areas and they start getting support from different humanitarian organizations, and they do well compared to the local population, the host communities, which are poor and they're starving. And so it creates resentment, and it actually fuels anti-northern resentment in the south. So humanitarian, it also can cause dependence. And so it's not a sustainable way to solve Yemen problem. I would like to see some shift to look at ways to create job opportunities and improve the local economy rather than just focus on humanitarian assistance.
The problem of the humanitarian assistance, aside from the fact that no economy can ever be built on begging, is it also has been somehow a way of how problematic regional, international war sites wash laundry their problems in Yemen. You would have countries like the US or the UK or even Canada, giving the overheads of their armed deals as a humanitarian assistance to Yemen. And then you see that gives them a pass and a better feeling about themselves, that they go back and do horrible things and sell more weapons for the whole year. That's one aspect of it. Second, I am not a believer in humanitarian assistance, specifically in a country like Yemen. And in fact, I think despite the good intentions of aid workers when it came to Yemen, the ultimate industry of aid, whether in Yemen or in Syria, has been one of the shapes of the wars that I look into. It is some sort of a war in itself. It looks like not a war, but that has been by itself various aspects of wars in at least how it looks from the Yemeni world point of view.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions, so I'll move on to the next question by John, who is with me here in Ottawa. There have now been 4 UN special envoys. On balance, have they helped or harmed? And as the current special envoy is larger in resources than any, may we expect the conflict to be solved? Or what kind of expectation can we have from the current one? And if your answer is in the negative, what would be the best prospects for an effective mediation role in Yemen? Starting with Farea, since you were the second one on the previous one.
I don't think it's either or. What we have to understand as Yemenis by the end of the day is, and that is no one's fault really as much internationally or regionally, that's Nadwa's and my fault, is we have failed as Yemenis into solving and sorting our stuff together and into solving our disputes. Therefore, when you fail in solving the house mess, you invite all sorts of neighbors and all sorts of outsiders. Then you end up in a process in which you're going to try to mitigate it. You're going to try to make, the best possible use of their presence, but it doesn't always work. My belief personally, despite that, there is not just in Yemen, in the region overall, the United Nations can no more solve these conflicts alone. Whether you bring a hero or you bring a Superman, you bring Hans, you bring Jamal bin Umar or anyone. I do not think that this ability because of the nature of the conflicts, but also because of the nature of how the United Nations functions. And we can see that today and how it is also set on an absolutely not just horrifying and horrible bylaws, but also an unfair one. When it comes to the B5, when it comes to the unjust power some countries has, all of this has destabilized the ability of the United Nations to be effective as much as it should be. An example of that we can see today is not just in Yemen, but look to what's happening in Ukraine, where some bunch of thug countries have blocked any possible attempts or real serious work from the United Nations. I do think that, however, usually it has to do with, as my colleague Abdul Ghani says, the UN envoy is a tool. If the internationals or if the Yemeni locals are willing to make use of that tool, then they can make use of that tool. But sometimes I think what happens is, even when they wanted to make use of that tool, that it was not able to capitalize, whether that's the envoys or the system by itself, on these moments. An example of that I find Stockholm Agreement, where I think there could have been a serious effort to actually do a much larger than what happened. And rather it ended up from an opportunity into missed an opportunity for a lot of reasons. By the end of the day, I have interacted pretty much with all the envoys and most of the diplomats who work in Yemen. And in their first weeks, usually my number one briefing bullet point is, if you want to solve Yemen conflict, you have to stop trying to solve it. This is also the problem of the UN envoys, is they come, they're in a hurry, they want to deliver, and obviously they have a reporting mechanisms that are not necessarily set into the world of Yemen's timeline, which obviously takes a lot of different accountability frameworks. It takes a different time, breath, and it takes a different set of tools by the end of the day. I think that's probably, if I have one critique or among the top of the UN envoys so far, I think that has been the way that has been the main one in that regard.
Nadwa, do you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, I don't think I wouldn't fault the envoys for the war in Yemen, or, I mean, there's been some mistakes, but the solution of the conflict in Yemen is beyond any UN envoy. And these envoys come and they're under extensive pressure by their bosses to achieve something really quick. We want a political settlement and we want ceasefire, and these things are simply impossible. So the expectations are too high from them. And they're pressured to achieve that, and they're kind of stuck in that. So I agree with Farea. The solution to Yemen conflict is not to solve the conflict, but to see where else you can help, kind of mitigate the impact of the conflict and resolve some of the issues that would make at least the war less crushing for Yemenis. Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Farea said. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So George has a question referring to something that Nadwa said in one of your remarks earlier on today. With regards to the prospects of the Saudis uniting anti-Houthi forces, how might this look in practice? Which is a very good question. Is this more about putting sufficient pressure on the disparate groups and local leaders, or more involved measures like integration of armed forces into unified forces? Starting with Nadwa, since that was to you, but Farea, if you want to jump in after, please feel free.
Yeah, I think the Saudis can sit with these actors, privately, and kind of tell them, this is what you need to do, and you need to work together militarily and politically. And especially in Aden, one of the issues, and again, I go back to the humanitarian situation and the situation with the services, the conflict between the SCC and Aden between the SCC and the government in Aden is impacting people's lives severely. There is fuel crisis, there's cooking gas crisis, the price of food are incredibly high. And Aden is pretty much a rundown city, and that can be avoided if the STC and the Hadi government stop punishing each other, stop punishing Adenis to prove that the other side is at fault. So the Saudis can come in and they can agree with these actors to at least resolve some of the issues so that certain services can be delivered. But at a larger picture, the Saudis should try to reform the anti-Houthi forces. It shouldn't be, Hadi should not be the only person in charge and shouldn't be the only person who has a say in this. Other actors should be involved and should be, should be part of a political arrangement as anti-Houthi forces. And, militarily, of course, if the Saudis decide these actors can move from different directions and they can push into the Houthi controlled areas and they can weaken the Houthis enough for the Houthis to feel that their best alternative is to come to the table. I'm not sure what the technicalities of it are, but it should look like that.
If Farea, I'd like to hear you on that, but if there's one element in this specific issue that I'd like you to look at is specifically the role of Hadi. Is peace possible even with him, given how corrupt he is, how it's been 7 years now, and he has not been able to do what the question just asked and what Nadwa just discussed, i.e. unite anti-Houthi forces. He has not shown that he has the skill, that he has the leadership, that he has the stamina to do this. So does the solution have to go beyond Hadi? Not just what Nadwa just said, which is give responsibility to others, but literally, to be blunt, another president. Isn't he part of the problem much more than the solution? And if yes, very easy to say, but how do you actually do that?
Nothing is possible with Hadi, neither winning nor losing. Even that, you can't have a failure with this guy. This is the problem, because when someone fails, you can back off and you say, okay, this plan failed, let's move forward. But in him, it's worse than that. It's worse than failure. It's worse than all of that. And it's not just the ability to win. Therefore, I think that ultimately, number one, the decision-making level within the government internationally should be changed and needs to be changed if we need to move anyway. Last time I was in Sana'a a few months ago, I spent there a month, and I told the Houthis leadership, I said, if Hadi dies tomorrow, I swear to God, you will be the biggest losers of that. There are very few gifts from God that can be as a blessing as having an enemy like him. Because I genuinely believe that it is, a very easy in that regard. I do want to come back to the original question, however, about, unifying all of these forces. There is something called the Riyadh Agreement that happened in 2018 or 19 in Aden under the Saudi sponsorship, which puts all the forces together, reshuffles the government, brings other group into the formula of the political formula we are having. And minus maybe one appendix or one attachment to the Riyadh Agreement, which I would throw away because I think it's impossible. Minus that specific line, I think this is very good agreement and it should be supported for that reason. And not just for the sake, not necessarily, I agree with the idea that all of these forces should go to the front line, because I don't think that will be possible in any ways. But if you have less of fragmentation in one area, if you have less of more than 10 people of command and control, if you have more people included in the political transition and no more Islah and Hadi are able to manipulate the political formula of the country, if you have some sort of a model for the people in Aden, that will be very good. That will be very good for Yemenis. It will be very bad news for the Houthis, and that can only be good. I think that's the framework where we have to think of in that regard. Not necessarily, again, for the goal of let's get these forces to the front line, because I think if you try something for 8 months and it doesn't work, then you should try something else. So if you try the war for 8 years and it didn't work, then definitely you should try something else. But in that regard, I think having that kind of less of a fragmentation within even one camp, and it happening in a way that's not the Houthi way in which they killed their ally Saleh, that would be actually good for Yemen and for the country overall.
Good, thank you. Roger has a question here on the issue of Yemen, the possibility of peace in Yemen as a single entity. Is the idea of Yemen itself even viable, or should, as part of a future peace process, should the idea of a separation between North and South come back on the table, as was the case from 1967 to 1990? Starting with Farea this time.
It seems to me that over the next few years or a decade, what we will end up, whether we talk, whether you call it a federalism or a confederalism or call it a self-determination, that seems to be the framework we will end up going into. A framework in which that the South feels totally assured that it will not gonna go and have another aggression in 10 years from the North. And that it remains to have that guarantee in a way, whether you call it again some sort of independence or federalism or confederalism, that will remain important. And that also with that, it needs to have the right of self-determination at one point for one reason, because that will be the only deterrence that will deter further forces from, again, going back and marching into Aden with their guns. And I believe that's important as a waving card to think of. Is that, are we going to go back to South and North? I don't think so. I don't think to the wishes of the South, to the wishes of the North. This is a lot of wishful thinking in many regards, because the fragmentation in the country happening is beyond the split of two and is beyond that regards. However, again, what you need to have is a framework which is already happening somehow with the war, that you have some sort of various centers. You have a center in Hadramaut, center in Mahra, center in Marib, center in Aden, center in Sana'a. What you need to make sure is these centers are no more in war with each other. That's number one. Number two is that they have some sort of a unified currency, some sort of that, and they have one passport, because that's just easier for the world and for Yemenis. Whatever you call that framework later on, call it confederalism, call it federalism, call it some sort of a political structure. I think it is the way of going back. There is no way of going back. There is no way to go back to a strong central state of Saleh. And there is no way of going back to even further, which is before 1990. These are illusions in all sense. The Houthis are having that illusion because they think they can control Yemen like Saleh. And some other actors in the South have some sort of illusions that they can go back to 1990. I don't think any of this. And when you look today to the public opinion in the South, especially after the last few years, it's no more excited as it used to be, because they saw also what it means to have a problematic, uncontained, and uncontrolled group like STC in a charge of various areas in the south of Yemen. Over.
Nadwa.
Yes, so a unitary state is a thing of the past, and Sana'a controlling all Yemen is a thing of the past. Forget about that. We don't know where things are going to go. I mean, this conflict is still evolving, but I agree with Farea. I think North and South is also not viable. I think what we've been seeing over the past 7 years is a de facto decentralization. People like to call it fragmentation, but I think it's de facto decentralization, because some of these areas that have kind of established autonomy have actually bloomed during the war. We've seen Marib, Shabwa, Jawf before the Houthis took it again, to some extent Hadramaut, and there is potential, in other areas as well. Taiz, even though there are major challenges, there are some positive, developments in Taiz in terms of, local governance. So I think this pattern will continue to evolve, and and I think it's important to reinforce it, if to kind of invest in these pockets of stability, these islands of stability. But to say we're not going to invest in these areas because this means we're supporting secession and we're supporting this fragmentation is really short-sighted. So we don't know where this is going to go, but I agree with Farea. I don't think we're going to have one state or even North and South.
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes left. I have a fairly large number of questions. I apologize in advance that I will not be able to go through all of them, but what I'll do now is that I'll take the first question from Marion, and then I'll combine the next 3 questions from Farouk, who is my Arabic teacher, Cameron and Linda, into one question, and then I'll ask Nadwa and Farea if you can take just a couple minutes to combine whichever parts of these two questions you think that you can refer to. First question by Marion is fairly specific. I'm not sure how you can answer that, but if you can, that's a very interesting one. What role can cultural exchanges and cultural heritage play in building peace and restoring trust between people in Yemen? And then the next question that I'll ask really combines the question from Farouk, Cameron, and Linda on how to incentivize peace. Can it be imposed from outside or not? That was Farouk's question, Cameron's question on what can we do to really bring, incentivize all relevant actors to compromise? You've touched a bit on that, but if you want to wrap up by synthesizing a bit your answers, Linda on that level asks whether a humanitarian track could be useful to further incentivize the Houthis to come to the negotiating table. So I'll leave you with a couple minutes each to try to touch on these two questions, maybe starting with Nadwa.
Yeah, I'll answer the first question and I'll leave the second and more difficult question to Farea. Cultural exchanges are very important, and I think they leave an impact. I mean, Farea and I are children of cultural exchange programs, right? And especially now, they're very important, and they're easier to do because we have social media and we have the internet, and pretty much everyone, especially the younger population, have access to that. And they're very important now, especially when we see, for example, in the Houthi-controlled areas where you see systematic indoctrination of children and young people with anti-West sentiment, anti-America sentiment, radical ideas. And I think we need to put stuff out there, for these young people to access, where they see the world for themselves and figure it out themselves. So I think these programs are very important, and they should be supported.
Good, thank you, Farah. Good luck with either that one or the broader incentivizing participation in the peace process.
I don't think there should be a humanitarian track for anything by itself, because it ends up again holding it hostage to the political track. And I don't think, telling from Sana'a airport, telling from the other files we have had, this has been from a negotiation point of view, not a good idea. When it comes to the incentivizing of peace, I think what we need to do is, and I think that was a strategic mistake in the GCC deal in 2011 and 12, is we need to rethink the concept of rewards and punishment. And this reward and punishment has, it kind of starts with the sanctions from the UN and others. First of all, these are the way they are being done, or also the international ones are not necessarily effective. And number two, they are rigid. So what you need to do, instead of having a list of people, these are the bad guys and these are the good guys, and we will just continue calling these guys bad and these guys good, no matter what each does. Instead of that, we need to have a criteria in which if you behave of this, then you are gradually taken out of this list, for example, of the punishment chair, and that you go gradually through it. Similarly, that if you misbehave in any way or hinder peace, then you get to make it to this list, whether you're Hadi or whether you're Ali Mahsen or whether you're Abdul Malik Al-Houthi. The ability to redefine reward and punishment is an essential need in Yemen, because also that was a mistake of the GCC deal. It gave an unconditional immunity that ultimately only incentivized people to pick their guns, do whatever they want to do, and not worry that anything will be a consequences for that. In Arabic, we have a very good proverb that says, "Man amina al-aquba sa al-adab." Whoever is sure there will be, no punishment, will most certainly misbehave. And I think that applies to warlords, not just to children. Over.
That was a very good way of finishing, Farah, so thank you for that. Unfortunately, again, with apologies to the handful of questions that are still there, it is 1 o'clock, at least here in Ottawa, so we will have to end. Of course, we could have continued the discussion for a long time, but we do have to stop. I want to thank primarily Farea and Nadwa for a great presentation. Thank you very much for taking 1 hour out of your very busy time to do this with us. I do also want to thank CIPS and the staff at CIPS, and especially Pierre, who helped us with the technical side of things. So thank you very much for that. And of course, thank you to everybody who attended. We have been doing this every year, 4 years in a row now at CIPS at Ottawa U. I fully expect that at some point in the next academic year, 22-23, we will be doing another version of our annual event, Yemen panel. So hope to see you there or to see you at some of our other events until then. So on that, thanks again to everybody and have a good weekend if that's where you're at now. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Also, thank you, Nadwa.
Thank you for having us.